Thank you, Professor Dunbar, for taking the time out and joining us today. And with your permission, and without further ado, I would now like to jump right into the SenseMaker conversation. So, for people who are watching us right now, and for people who will be watching in the future, this is the book, How Religion Evolved. And as you can see, there are some things poking out from the book that doesn't come with the book. You have to read it and then make notes. It's an interesting book to make notes. It's also an interesting book to think aloud with every once in a while, but do it in isolation of your study, or perhaps where people don't see you, or else your religious moment could be called a lot of things, which Professor Dunbar deals at the end of the book under things around cultism. Professor, when I was talking to somebody about doing the interview regarding this book, one of the questions that came up from an economist who studies religion in the place that you're based in right now was, why should religion be studied from an evolutionary psychology perspective? What is the need to do this? I had some arguments that I gleaned from the book, but I would like to put this question to the author of the book. Why do it?
Well, the obvious answer is religion is a major part of human culture, has been for as long as we have historical records, and indeed archaeological records. We can trace evolutions back many, even tens of thousands of years, maybe. And so, anything that impacts in the way that religion does on human behavior, in the end, must have an evolutionary explanation. Even economics, dare I say, must have an evolutionary underpinning to it somewhere, in the sense that economics is based on some utility function. Well, the question arises: why does that utility function work in our brains, as it were, that motivates us to rush out and work hard at tasks and be paid money for doing so? Everything that we do as humans has an evolutionary component to it. This might mean that it has some genetic underpinnings, and if it has something to do with the brain, it probably does. But equally, in modern evolutionary theory, you don't necessarily have to have a genetic basis for a particular phenomenon. It may be a product of cultural evolution, which is feeding into a species' capacity to survive and reproduce successfully and avoid extinction. And I guess at that point, we come very close to economics, because as you'll be well aware, there is a branch of economics called evolutionary economics, which is actually much more about learning than about anything to do with genes, of course. But, an evolutionary process is a process of change. And the question is it directed change or just random change? If it's in some sense directed change because there's some optimal solution, perhaps, or some goal that the organism needs to get to in order to survive successfully, then it has an evolutionary component to it in very much a sort of biological sense. So I think we have to avoid getting too worried about the relationship between the word evolution and genetics, which is what everybody worries about. In modern evolutionary theory, there are many ways of evolution happening that don't necessarily involve genetic determination of behavior, but which involve the propagation of genes into future generations as what the economists would call the utility functions. So everything in the world, if it's biological, has an evolutionary component to it.
Right. So that answers that question. But if we were to kind of train our argument around the different religions or the different function that religion serves, what is that one unifying thing that religion has, all the religions across space and time, that they've been able to do, which is important for the continuation of the human species. Because, as you point out in the book, there are several uh, opportunity costs for people who get into a certain form of religiosity.
Mm.
So, the overarching superstructure of religion, without without getting into the fragmented different religions that are there. So, what is that one crucial function that religiosity has been able to do for the human animal?
Okay, it's just worth perhaps pointing out to begin with um, a common view. A common view, since you kind of allude to it, really, common view has been that religion is very costly to people. After all, people may actually die for the sake of their religions, their belief in their religion, and that, from an evolutionary point of view, is, shall we say, not a great idea. If you die, you don't reproduce yourself or anything else, for that matter. That's the end of your story. So it has led a lot of people to suggest that even something like religion, indeed in some cases even something like culture, has no particular function. It's just a kind of accidental byproduct of how the human brain is organized to deal with other engagements with the physical world out there. And in that sense, it's can be maladaptive. It just serves no function. Now, having thought a lot about this, I actually came to the conclusion that this is a misunderstanding of evolutionary processes, because it sees evolutionary processes entirely driven by what's of benefit to you as an individual. So if you like, that's a classic economist view of the world. Your utility function is to maximize your, let's say, your income by working very hard for the highest price that you can get, and that's the end of the story. But what this view from a biological point of view forgets, of course, is that every individual is embedded within a social environment, a social network, and that social network itself, the social group, is part and parcel of our ability to work effectively in the world as we encounter it. It's part and parcel of our evolutionary strategies. So the question then is, well, what role might religion play in that? And the argument in the book is twofold. One is that the direct response to that last question is, what it is one of a suite of behaviors we use to create a sense of social cohesion within a group, so that the group then functions as a single unit in solving the problems of successful survival and reproduction. So that's one level, but there's a question below that then, which says, well, why are we susceptible to religion? Okay, we can see some benefit to it, if you like, but why are we susceptible to it? And that, I think, comes down to the one universal feature of all religions, and that is what I call the mystical stance. There is a sense in which we experience, particularly in the context of circumstances like trance states, during meditation and so on, what is often described as a direct contact with the mind of God, or some such wording. Every religion, or certainly all the major religions, have this experience in some context or other, and all describe it in some way in that sort of sense. You feel as though you are in direct contact with whatever the supreme being or the supreme creator, whatever words you want to use, is. And I think that is a kind of byproduct of our extraordinary capacity to engage intellectually and in many other ways with the world we're doing. Part and parcel of the process, and we'll come back to this no doubt, the process of how we bond societies. But and of course, it doesn't happen necessarily to everybody. But if I have these kind of mystical experiences, I can explain them to you through language and say this is really wonderful, and this is the answer to the universal question of life and what's life all about, as it were, and persuade you to come and join my religion. And that also then allows lots of possibility for religions to diversify in the way which we see. Clearly there is not one religion. There may be many common themes in that most of them believe in some kind of God or equivalent, if you like. But nonetheless, what seems to be underpinning it is this magical experience, really, that people get in the context of this. And this goes back to my central argument in many ways, that people don't join religions for intellectual reasons. They are not convinced by the theology. They accept the theology as an explanation. What convinces them is some emotional experience, what's often referred to as a conversion experience, a deeply emotional experience that is often very agonizing in some ways, but you emerge out of it with a sort of cathartic outcome in which you feel enlightened and at peace with the world, and that you're in safe hands in God's keeping, if you like, is how you might often describe it.
If I may now shift, and this is something that I'm going to continue to do, slightly change times that we are looking at. You just talked about mysticism, and in your book, you talk about Sufis and Qawwali, the music form that they use to kind of render themselves to God, if you will,
Yes.
be lost in it.
Yes.
Now, Qawwali is still a very famous and a very potent art form today in South Asia and perhaps the world over. Yet it is, to a certain extent, lost that connection with religion that it had. My question, and I'm not trying to raise questions on how the scientific method looks at it. When we look at mysticism and experiences of this sort, are we perhaps trying too hard to connect the two dots? Or is it that religion and these experiences have followed each other, and by that they are conjoined but might have served different purposes? We'll stick to the utilitarian method, if you will.
That's a very good question, of course, and there's always, if you like, a problem with any historical science. So trying to explain how things evolve is always tricky, because largely you're dealing with correlations. I mean, there are now very sophisticated statistical methods which allow us to sort of reconstruct the past and see the timings at which causes and their effects, or their proposed effects, change in the course of evolutionary time, because obviously causes need to precede their effects rather than follow their effects. Otherwise, the physicists will get very, very concerned that the world doesn't have any rational stability. So there are ways of dealing with this. The big problem in many ways is if you're dealing with something that only one species does, and there's no evidence that any other species other than humans has these kind of full-scale religious experiences, or what we would recognize and describe as full-scale religious experiences. We are the only species that does that. That's always very difficult to look at in this kind of historical way, because we have nothing to compare it with. We have no, we can't really see species which have only one, either the cause present but not the effect yet, or the effect later. So there's no clear way of testing those kind of things. But what we can do still, I think, is build a kind of spider's web of interrelated explanations as to how and why something's evolved. And we a lot of those we can study experimentally in the here and now and in the world today. And this is kind of what the book tries to do, really. It sort of says, well, here's a proposal for why religions have evolved and how they've evolved, the function they serve for us, and the mechanisms that they build on and that make those religious experiences possible. And then some of those bits and pieces we can do an experiment on in the laboratory, or we can do comparative analyses across human ethnographic groups, across different tribal groups, and see how these things change within historical timescales. Because, sort of, at least with ethnographic data, you can look back and reconstruct their origins, as it were, in time depths that maybe are on the order of 60 or 70,000 years ago, by fitting together different tribal behaviors, if you like, different tribal cultures, to reconstruct their ancestries. So there are ways of getting at it. I kind of work with both traditions. So the comparative methods, which try to reconstruct ancestral states and then see how they change through time. But also we do a lot of laboratory work. We've gone out and literally studied religious services, people in religious services, to show that the pharmacological underpinnings of these mystical processes are occurring in everyday religious services in different kinds of religions. So we haven't done all the world's religions, regrettably. That would be a very big task, but we've done it within several. So there are ways of getting at these things, I think, and I'm a great believer in really, viewing these kind of problems as an enormous jigsaw that you're trying to fit all the pieces together. So if you can get all the pieces to fit together, it gives you a very, very robust explanation, I think.
Thank you, Professor. Really makes it a little bit clear for me. I still have my doubts, but perhaps we'll bring them up later if we have some time. Because there are a lot of people who want to ask you questions, and I have to kind of do my bit within 50 minutes to an hour. So
right.
There is a very interesting expression that you use in the book, and that expression is to do with how ritual has come about due to, let's put it like this, certain bioactive compounds that are released once you get into the trance state. Different cultures have used different things. It's been opium, betel nut, so on and so forth, and magic mushroom. So you call it magic mushroom in antiquity, which is great. It's an expression I love. I have now taken it up. So explain to me the importance, because what I'm getting in, and correct me if I'm wrong, I could completely be, religion needs these immersive moments for a group of people to come out of it and then get together a large group to kind of follow them behind. What is the role of these immersive rituals that are induced by an external stimuli?
Right.
So, and does this hold true for all of the religion? Because you give specific examples from different religions across the world. Does it hold true now even? So were the FBI to raid a moving, camping, religious experience in the southern part of the United States, would we see some active compounds that these pastors should not be working with?
This could be getting us into very difficult water with
It's just a hypothetical question.
This whole history of religious experiences. So you rightly point out to the importance of rituals. So again, this is back to this distinction between the theology and the practice of religion. The practice of religion is always about the rituals, right? And it's the rituals that seem to create this sense of both this sense of immersion in the divine principle, if you like, the divine mind, but also this sense of being a member of an earthly community, a congregation, a member of the same temple or mosque or church or whatever it is. Now that process, both processes in that particular case are underpinned by the same psychopharmacological agents in the brain. And this goes back to the fact that religion is one of a kind of what I call the social toolkit, the behaviors that allow us to bond together, both as friends, but also as a wider community. And this is the endorphin system in the brain. The endorphin system in the brain is part of the brain's pain management system. It operates in response particularly to light, slow, chronic forms of pain or stress on the body, and dampens them down, so it allows you to keep going even though the muscles are feeling very tired. So marathon runners are very glad to have this system, I think, to allow them to get through to the end of such a long race. The endorphin system has been exploited in our primate cousins, the monkeys and apes, as the mechanism for creating social bonding. And it comes through, if you watch monkeys and apes, they spend a lot of time grooming each other, grooming the fur. Looks like just cleaning the fur. What they're doing is the movement of the hands across the fur and the skin is triggering the endorphin system. We still do it. It's why when we have a conversation with people that we are close to, our family and our close friends, there is an awful lot of touch that goes on. We stroke them, pat them on the shoulder, put an arm around the shoulder, or whatever it may be. And this physical contact triggers the endorphin system. But the problem with the endorphin system in the way it's used in this context is its intimacy makes it difficult to do with large groups. So when humans evolved much larger groups than monkeys and apes have in general, the size of groups that we live in now, they had to find other ways to trigger the system, and virtually, so it didn't involve physical touch. And what happened was they discovered that if you sing, if you dance, if you listen to music, even if you eat together, feast together, if you tell emotional stories, and if you engage in the rituals of religion, all of these trigger the endorphin system and do it for a large number of people. And if you do it in synchrony, it seems to ramp the whole mechanism up, so you get a much bigger effect. And we've shown this experimentally, both with brain scanning studies and pharmacological studies and behavioral studies, that all of these activities ramp up the endorphin system, activate the endorphin system, and at the same time make us feel very bonded to the people we're doing it with. Just not the people, our friends who are not there, but even strangers that we do these activities with, we feel a sense of belonging and community with them. And religion seems to exploit this effect to produce this endorphin system. So the endorphins are one of a very important class of opiate or opioid-like drugs. Except the big difference, so like morphine, for example, is another of the same class. The difference is that endorphins we do not get addicted to in the way we get addicted to opium and morphine and all these other drugs. Endorphins are a natural product and very, very important, but they create this same sense of lightheadedness, of calmness, of relaxation. All is at peace with the world, and of trust in the people that you're engaged in these activities with. And we think that that's what creates this sense of belonging and community. And we've shown with survey studies that people who attend religious services very regularly, perhaps every day, feel they are deeply engaged with and bonded with the congregation of the particular church, temple, mosque, or whatever, the synagogue that they attend. They feel that they have many friends because the whole congregation is their friendship circle, and they feel very comfortable and embedded within that, and they feel very supported, of course. But the interesting thing with the endorphin system is it seems that if you really ramp it up, what it does is trigger a trance state, and then you get these mystical experiences. And in hunter-gatherer societies, these are often used. This mechanism is often used to trigger trance states, and it's the trance states that make the community feel very embedded. Now, the problem is, how do you get these trance states to occur? How do you ramp up the endorphin system in the brain? Well, it turns out you can do it in a number of different ways. You can kind of do it the sledgehammer way, which is by various drugs. So lots of drugs produce these kind of psychobiological experiences, as it were, mind states, and lead into trance. For example, mescaline and magic mushrooms that you mentioned, opium, alcohol, and many of the plants that became part and parcel of our kind of village medicines used to cure different kinds of things have these kind of properties. And we find evidence for marijuana seeds, opium seeds in the archaeological record very, very early on, over the last 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years. They were very often used in a religious context, and often restricted in their use to the priests, because they were regarded as very dangerous, if you like, experiences that you might have. But there's a kind of softer way of doing it, which is through exercise, so through dance. So you see in many traditional small-scale tribal societies, you'll have very taxing, exhausting dances, which once you get completely exhausted, usually often will flip over into trance states. And then, there are the very sophisticated ways of doing this, because at one level, what's producing these effects is very light stress on the body system, the muscles in the system. And one of the ways of doing that is through singing or through breath control. And so you see the very sophisticated mechanisms for producing trance states that you get in the yoga tradition and in Buddhism, for example. Meditative practices in Buddhism are all built around breath control, because breath control is very difficult for the body to have these long, slow inhalations and exhalations. And that seems to trigger if you get it right and control it very well, it just triggers these trance states. So there are various ways of producing these trance states, some of which might get you into trouble with the authorities, and some of which won't. But what's interesting is when you have those experiences, it produces a very, very electric sense of religious experience. And the very famous one is the Boston Chapel experiment, where they took a bunch of, in the 50s, they took a bunch of theology students from, I think it was Harvard University, from the theology faculty there. So they're all prospective Christian ministers, pastors, and so on, doing their training. And I think it was the Easter service, so it's often known as the Easter experiment as well. They gave them one of these South and Central American LSD-like drugs, and these people who then went on to afterwards to be pastors or ministers in their respective churches, all say that experience they had at that service under the influence of that drug is the most rich and magical and mystical religious experience they ever had in their lives, and in the 40 years afterwards. So it's a very intense experience that you get. The great difficulty with it, I think, and this is reflected in, for example, the Sufi tradition in Islam, but also the mystical traditions within Christianity, that these mystical experiences create anarchy, basically. They're very much associated with individual experiences, and therefore they're often sort of sideways to the standard theology of the religion, and responsible for creating new cults and sects that emerge out of the bottom of the religion, and the hierarchy then does not like them, is afraid of them because of their anarchic properties. It can completely destroy a religion, if you like, and often attempts to suppress them in order to keep theological purity, if you like, for the religion. So a long explanation for a short question, I'm afraid.
No. Absolutely kind of gets it all together. Though I see that you did not answer my question about the specific southern United States, but I will not hold you to that.
Well, I mean, I think the answer is probably there aren't too many funny drugs involved in those kinds of traditions. They do some weird things. So they're in the Pentecostal tradition of Christianity in the southern United States. They have all these experiences with handling dangerous snakes, for example. So, part of the service will be handling rattlesnakes, which, if they bite you, you may not survive, and people do die. But I think the fear that's produced by that experience is what triggers the endorphin system, because the endorphin system's trying to dampen this kind of response down, the stress effects, the fear effects that you have from a particular occasion, in order to allow you to keep going. In other words, you might think of the real value of the endorphin system. It occurs, when the tiger is right behind you, and you're exhausted from running away. The endorphin system allows you to keep running, because without the endorphin system, everything would be too painful and you'd have to stop. And of course, the tiger would catch you and eat you. But the endorphin system is designed to keep you going through the pain threshold and allow you to escape whatever the situation is. It might be somebody attacking you. It might be a predator like a tiger trying to eat you. So, those kind of fear and pain experiences trigger the endorphin system, and you can, some religions really do use that to heighten this kind of religious experience. Most of them probably engage much more in dancing. I mean, I guess the other one, I don't know how common this would be in the southern United States, but certainly in parts of the Caribbean, Jamaica and places, is Rastafarianism, which obviously uses bang, marijuana, hemp as part of its religious services. And that goes back through time. You see an echo of it even in the Christian services with at communion, the wine and the wafer, which presented to you as being the body or the memory of the body and blood of Christ at his crucifixion. In fact, alcohol produces these endorphin-like effects very strongly and enhances this kind of religious experience. So although you're only getting a tiny sip usually, historically, if you go back, alcohol was often a central part of religious services all over the Eastern Mediterranean. So certainly in Egypt, it was regarded as the part and parcel of religious services in the Egyptians, but only the priests were allowed to have it because it was dangerous for the common folk.
Right. So now I'm going to come to the modern time. I have two specific questions around it. One comes in part of a paper that you wrote, rather, it was a short article based on a paper you've written a long time ago. The article was published in The Conversation, where you are trying to make the academic community understand the 150, the Dunbar number, why it has persisted.
Right.
And in one of the arguments you make about, I think a study had just come out from Stockholm, which had tried to change the number. And this has been going on for a long time because it's a very powerful it's a very powerful tool to think about how many people can you know. So you know 5,000 faces, you have five intimate friends, but you have 150 people that you know.
Mm.
Uh, and then you develop that argument in the book as well. And you use a specific case from 1974. I think it is David Wastel's study that you quote about self limiting churches. And
All
you
right.
come up
Mm.
and you say that essentially the expansion of most of these religions dependent on uh, different communities coming up together, and the number was around 200. I agree with all of this. I'm not competent enough to get into argument either with you or Professor Boston. But if I think about COVID-19, and Pew does this how many people still believe in God survey every
Mm.
year. For example, this year, the survey says that 28% Americans do not believe in any religion or perhaps God. And then in the middle of the pandemic, between lockdown 2 and 3 in Germany, a very interesting paper caught my eye, which said that Germans who used to believe in religion, in a higher power, or in God, their faith and their trust in all of this has started coming down. The Americans, on the other hand, who were having a very bad COVID thanks to
Mm.
their president at the time, had started believing in God.
Mm.
So, very long question to ask. To what level is the trust or the belief in God dependent still on the idea of uh, kingship, not kinship, but kingship, because religion and power and
Right.
politics have come out. I mean, if you're talking on the evolutionary time scale, then the king as the embodiment of religion, or king as the embodiment of God or God's will, has only gone for around, let's say, 100 years or less than 100 years. So, how strong is it that if you have the next pandemic, or if you have something that is not going according to plan, you would suddenly want to get back into the good grace of God?
Right. Yes. Well, there's quite a lot of evidence actually from large-scale studies that religious affiliations increase during times of great civil strife and stress. So pandemics, maybe earthquakes, these kind of things, but also civil wars. So there's a very nice study that looked at the effect of religious affiliations in areas, provinces of different countries in Africa and Asia, where there'd been active civil wars compared to provinces of the same country which had been safe from the civil war effects as it hadn't been involved. So these are sort of local civil wars that occur in particular regions. And it showed very nicely that there was an increase in religious affiliation under the influence of the stresses created by civil war. So I think, I think it was Freud, the founding father of psychoanalysis, who said 100 years or so ago that people believe in God or in religions as really I suppose you might even say a very primitive form of science, in the sense that religion provides an explanation for how the world works and why it works in a particular way, and also gives you control over it in a context where you are powerless as a mere mortal human to prevent these terrible things happening in your locality. But hopefully, if you appeal to God, God will sort things out for you and make your life better. And that's a very deep belief that we have. You see that all the way back through all the great modern religions of the world, all through the doctrinal type religions, polytheistic religions of tribal societies, where they have many gods, a different god for each part of the everyday world, as it were, a god for planting and a god for the rains and a god for war and all these kind of things. This appeal to divine beings and making sacrifices to them in some form to satisfy them, so that they will make sure the world works in a way which is beneficial to you. And of course, we kind of secretly do that every day when we look at our horoscopes in the newspaper or on TV or somewhere, to see, what is there in our future that we can go look forward to or be worried about. So we have this. There's undoubtedly a theme there, if you like, about our psychology, which worries about the future with good reason, and that there are solutions to it. And people like oracles who can foretell the future for you are very, very ancient. We know about many of them from history, as it were, historical records. So there is that sense in which religion gives you control over the world that is really psychologically comforting. Now, what's interesting, the difference that you highlighted there between Europe, where the response to the pandemic was less religiousness, whereas in America it was more religiousness. I think you have to see that in the context of recent history, in the sense that Europe generally has been declining very, very rapidly in religious belief over the last half century or so. Demonstrably so. Of course, it has been relatively peaceful, or very peaceful actually, since 1945. It's only recently Ukraine on the fringes of Europe, but it's getting close, as you might say, that there have been any serious wars going on. And so this sense of peace, and there's nothing to worry about, because the world in which you live is peaceful, you can see might make people less interested. But I think you have to see this against the history of the United States. The United States, remember, was founded by religious refugees right the way back in the first settlements in the 1600s, late 1500s, early 1600s. And especially so, in the context of the American independence from Britain back in the 1770s. There is a deeply religious stream of consciousness in the American psyche, which has been there for a very long time, as a result of why those particular people moved there. They were all trying to escape essentially religious persecution in Europe, from all over Europe. So it's people sort of coming from all the countries of Europe, not just Britain, to what is now the United States. Interestingly, Canada seems to have escaped a lot of that, but that's an interesting question itself. But I think you just have to remember that the United States has this deeply religious history, which is only very slowly being shaken off, whereas it was shaken off much, much earlier, if you like, in Europe.
While we stick to it and we think about the theories of mind and the state of mind and the way you see it, because religion plays a very important role even in that. Two specific questions, very short, because I would like to have a sort of an exposition from you on this. One, you have these people who refuse to believe that the world was not created by the world was created by an intelligent design, and these people are, let's call them uber religious, and then there are people on the other side who talk about free will. Now, does free will exist? Does free will not exist? Is it just something that is philosophical in nature? That's a different conversation, because I think you mentioned Daniel Dennett in the book, and from bacteria to Bach is wonderful, and in that he goes and does something interesting about free will. But from you, religion and free will, and religion and the refusal to look at scientific evidence. What's happening here?
Well, I think the issue here is a general psychological problem that we all have in everyday life, really, is, we come to some sort of view about how the world works and how people behave out there and so on. And we just don't like our views to be challenged, particularly. It's very uncomfortable if somebody comes along and says to you, "Oh, what you believe is completely wrong about the world. It's not flat. It's actually round, and it's revolves around the sun rather than the sun revolving around the earth." And if you've not had the benefit of a deep high school and university education, and not read about these things, the evidence is quite clear. I see it every day. The sun goes around the world. Why should you believe otherwise? So sometimes these scientific explanations, are very complex, very left field, and unexpected. If you come across them for the first time. But whenever that happens, we're very challenged by it. We don't like it, and we just see it in all sorts of contexts. We see it in religious contexts. People when a new religion arrives and challenges their old religion, they usually react very badly and persecute the new religion. We don't like it when people challenge our political views, or even our scientific views. If somebody comes along to you and says, "Your particular theory of how this economic process works is wrong, I've got a better idea," your immediate response is to say, "What? I've believed this for 25 or 30 years. It can't be completely wrong." And you can understand in that context, somebody doesn't want to surrender their lifetime's beliefs, because particularly for scientists and academics, as it were, like us, it means everything you've done so far is wasted. That would be a terrible, terrible sacrifice to have to make. So we have this natural resistance, I think, to believing new ideas when they appear, and in general reacting very badly to challenges of that kind. But a lot of this, you mentioned theory of mind at the beginning of your question, and the mentalizing, and that's a really important part of this, because this is the capacity to understand other people's intentions, and it's very sophisticated. The great apes are the only ones that really have this capacity among other animals, but we have it in much greater degree than even the great apes have it, in that it's what allows us to engage in conversations with each other and to discuss things and to think about things. And it then plays a very important role in the ideology, if you like, of religion, because it allows us to formulate very complex propositions, theological propositions, much more complex theological propositions than we would be capable of if we did not have such sophisticated abilities. But it's that allows us to kind of negotiate our way through the evidence and the complexities of what we experience in science and the other, and I'm including the social sciences and even the humanities here, in the sense of science and the Greek sense of knowledge about the world. To negotiate our way through the evidence and the theories and competing theories to come to some better understanding. So that you kind of, without those abilities, you cannot have religions as a communal activity, in the same sense that economics is a communal activity by a group of economists around the world, all working hard at little bits of the economic puzzle, if you like, jigsaw, or any other field of science. Ecologists, the community of ecologists around the world, they can only, their disciplines can only progress because they can engage in reasoned discussions with each other and interrogations, as it were, of the evidence for and against alternative theories. So that plays really an incredibly important part in the development, the history, the evolution, if you like, of religions as individual cases. But it's always subject to this drawback that we don't like having our theories proved wrong. So these two factors that act against, psychological factors that act against each other, really, and we have to hope and work very hard to put the mentalizing component in the front rather than put the dislike of being challenged ideologically in the front. Because if we allow the ideology to take over, we don't make scientific progress, and therefore presumably humanistic progress. Whereas if we allow the reasoning component, the rational component that theory of mind allows us to engage in, then the possibility of progress awaits us. It is just up to our ingenuity to find the right pathway to the top of the mountain.
Thank you, Professor. I now realize that I'm hitting that 1 hour magic mark, but I still have a lot of questions. But I'm going to now get into a runway of 2 and then open it up to everybody else who's joined to ask questions as they may. So my second last question, and there are many to choose from, but this is the one that I'm going to go with. You talk a bit about doctrinal religions and how they've come up. And, in these, there are 3 special religions. They've come from one particular part of the world, and all 3 of them are at loggerheads with each other. But the religions that are missing from it, so I would like to draw your attention to the Norse gods. They are very interesting. They are, in a way, doctrinal, but also very warlike. Second, the Druids. And third, the shamans.
Yes.
So all 3 of them, they create sort of a reverse image of these 3 doctrinal religions that you talk about. And yet, the doctrinal religion that you talk about, they have existed for a very long time and perhaps will exist till as long as humanity does. But these other 3, they have either been subsumed or they have become very peaceful, so peaceful that they can't really exist because the Druid religion in Lebanon is constantly threatened by other religions in the
Right.
area.
Yes.
And then you
Yes.
have the shamans. So
Yes.
shamans are still very capable of
Yep.
expanding to the world, but the last time they did it under the able guidance of one Genghis Khan.
Yes.
Sadly, Genghis is no longer around.
Yeah.
Tell us about the interplay of the sense of adventurism that allows these religions to bloom.
Yep.
And it's not the core principle of the religion that allows it to go ahead.
Yes. Well, I might just point out to you an interesting quirk of history in that the Scandinavian gods have not gone away. Every day in English, when we refer to the days of the week, we dutifully remind ourselves of the Norse gods. Tuesday, Tuesday, that's the wife of Woden, the top god, if you like. Wednesday, Woden's Day, or Odin is the Norse god. Friday, Freya, the sister of, or Thor. Thursday, Thor's Day. The son of Woden, and to Friday, Freya's Day, the Thor's sister. So I think when the Vikings left after colonizing England and Scotland for many hundreds of years, and when they finally left, were thrown out by the Normans, who were more Vikings, but Christianized Vikings from France. thrown out. I think we had to promise to remember their gods by incorporating their names in the days of the week. So it's a kind of lovely historical example of how these things can still hang over us, well, 1,500 years later. But
Revenge of the High Norse.
yes, indeed so. But I think you have to see these various examples that you give are really part of the pattern. So if you look at the historical sequence of the evolution of religion, it has a very, very clear pattern in that all early human religions, as represented by their widespread in tribal societies, are basically shamanistic in form, or at least I refer to them as shamanistic in form. They often do involve shamans as healers and maybe foretellers of the future. But the sense of which these religions, in a more general sense, is they involve these trance states which everybody can experience if they wish to. The shamans are just the specialists, if you like, that have acquire special powers through their training. But they are these religions do not tend to have formal gods. They recognize the spirit world into which you can go on spirit travels as a result of entering trance states. But you meet all sorts of bad spirits and good spirits. Good spirits are often ancestors. But they all have a very, very similar description of how these things work. They all experience these spirit travels during trance states as very exhilarating, but also very frightening, mainly because of the evil spirits that try to capture you while you're in the spirit world and so on. So these kind of religions seem to be extremely ancient, and we see them, they're kind of reflections in all these things like wishing wells and wishing trees, banyan trees. You might hang something off as sort of a request for the spirit world to look after you. All these deep psychological traditions that are still very widespread. We don't know when these first emerged, several 100,000 years ago, for sure, possibly even as much as 500,000 years ago in perhaps simpler forms. But the big sea change occurred in the aftermath of the last ice age. So when the last ice age retreated, it left and this was about 10,000 years ago only, it left a very rich environment in what's known as the subtropical zone. That's the very narrow area just above the tropics at both the north and the south end of the world. But the north end of the world seems to have been particularly rich. And what you find is that by about 7 or 8,000 years ago, so quite quickly, a whole new kind of religion emerges. And these are what I call what are often called the doctrinal religions. They're religions that have many gods, all associated with different things. So the Norse gods would be a classic example of this. Thor is the god of war or something like that. Each god has a different thing that he or she looks after. And these gods are very demanding. You have to keep sacrificing to them. If you don't sacrifice to them, they will wreak vengeance on you. They're not really interested in humans as such. They're just interested in receiving sacrifices from you. And that's what keeps the system going. And it creates at the same time this sense of belonging. What it also introduces is things like divine moral codes. So moral codes that are handed down from the gods, for example.
Professor, may I stop you here for a minute?
Yep.
And just an interjection, and sorry for doing this.
That's right.
But in the God of the Old Testament is a God of this sort.
Yes.
And the Jewish faith. Does it have to do anything with the fact that some of these faiths, like Judaism, to the best of my knowledge, does not really have a faith in afterlife, as did the Norse?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think a belief in afterlife seems to be very old. It's not a necessary feature of religions, but it's clear from the fact that 20,000, 30, 40,000 years ago, people were burying their family members in tombs and providing them with goods to see them through, grave goods, as they usually know, see them through the next life in the next world. These are really quite ancient beliefs. But you're right that Judaism in particular did not have a concept, certainly historically, and possibly still maybe doesn't, in all its branches, a belief in an afterlife, as it were. That's not an entirely universal feature of religions. I think it just, sort of, one argument is that belief in the afterlife is a solution to the deep pain you feel when those you love die, or perhaps are killed by predators or by raiders from some other part of the country. That psychological pain is recognized as being kind of ameliorated by the belief that there is somewhere they've gone to, and you will meet up with them again in your turn in due course. But that belief seems to be extremely ancient, as far as we can see. Certainly, the archaeological record would suggest that, and the fact that it's really by and large universal throughout many cultures in the world. This belief. Okay, so the key thing about the rise of these doctrinal religions then is that they're associated with living in villages, and this seems to have happened particularly in this very narrow band above which runs through the Mediterranean, right the way through the Middle East, right down the Ganges plain, and through into the Great Basin in China. And at around that time, and only there, in anywhere in the world, you see the rise of villages and cities. You see the rise of small-scale empires, the Harappan Empire in the Ganges Plain, for example. And these are always associated with doctrinal religions, a shift from shamanistic, hunter-gatherer, animistic religions to these doctrinal religions. And the marker for this is always the presence of priests and temples, specialist religious buildings, and very often signs of sacrifices. There are altars that have holes to let blood drip out of, for example. And that happened within a very short time period, somewhere around 7,000 to 8,000 years ago only, in this narrow band all around the world, at least the old world, and it came a bit later in the Americas. And that's because the population didn't show this massive increase in size in the Americas. But what's interesting is a few thousand years later, you have another great trauma, because there was a sudden drying. The Sahara at this stage was like a kind of it's what's called the Green Sahara. It's a kind of agricultural nirvana. There was big, massive lakes, huge lakes, and massive rivers, and hippopotamuses and crocodiles and fish and antelope all over the Sahara. And then about 4,000 years ago, it suddenly dried up over a period of about 300 years. It just dried up to the way it is now, changing climate. And this happened in the Ganges Plain. It happened in the Great Basin in China as well. And all the empires collapsed. And what you see at that point is a new kind of religion arising, which are sometimes known as the axial age religion, because they're nearly all monotheistic in some form. And they are the world religions as we have them now, the Judeo-Christian ones, the monotheistic religions in Egypt at this time, Hinduism, with concept still of although it has many gods, still there is this Rama, the supreme god, and so on. Buddhism, with this sort of you might say doesn't have a sense of gods, but it kind of does, really hidden in behind it. And you see the same in China, these kind of monotheistic religions. They don't necessarily last a long time. But what's interesting is they all appear at this time. They're all associated with sheep-based economies, primarily pastoralism. Something peculiar about pastoralism, which allowed or seems to have necessitated this form of very intense religious experience. And the interesting difference is you have this shift from gods who don't care about humans, as in these doctrinal religions, such as the Norse gods, to God, to a supreme God who really is genuinely concerned with the well-being of humans on Earth. And there are still hints of these sort of doctrinal religion minor gods scattered around, except now in these religions we tend to refer to them as saints or bodhisattvas in Buddhism, of course, who are special people in that sense, that support the grand religion and the figurehead, as it were, in some way, and to whom we can pray and obtain help in promoting our achievement of heaven or nirvana or whatever it may be that the religion prescribes for your future next life, as it were.
Okay, Professor, thank you so much for that. I have a last question before I open it up to everybody else, and there are quite a few questions there as well. My last question is going to be a very easy one. In your book, and this is something that I've come across because before I became an economist, I spent a lot of time doing biology. So religiosity can be ascribed to one particular part in the brain. That's the prefrontal cortex. And study after study has proved that. The site of these great revelations of saints has been located in the prefrontal cortex. With the change in technology, with the change in how people are now consuming different things, and if you look at people even 100 years back, the amount of sensory information that your brain had to deal with was nothing compared to what you have now. You could wake up and 5 million you have a sensory overload 30 seconds after you've woken up. Something that would have taken perhaps 11 months in, let's imagine Robert Thomas Malthus. So the sensory overload that would have taken 11 months for Malthus, perhaps we get it in a span of a day, all of that. So our brains are changing very, very slowly, but our brains are changing. What impact is what is the impact that a changing brain is going to have on a believing brain, a brain of a faithful? How should we be looking at it?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, actually. I'm sure the answer to the question should be very short and simply to say, I have no idea, because it's very difficult to predict the future. The one thing you shouldn't do in evolution is try to predict where the future is going to go. Even if you can predict the future in economics, it's dangerous to predict in biology. One of the question raises some interesting issues for us that we should probably worry ourselves about. And I suspect the key issue is that religion very often seems to strike us, if you like, in times of stress and uncertainty and crisis. And indeed, many conversions are often associated with personal crises that people go through. And then they get invited to go perhaps to some temple or church or mosque or whatever. And they have a religious conversion and join whatever the religion is. My worry would be in this context precisely that the overload that we are subjected to, and of course this is a particular problem with social media, is because before social media, we only saw our local community and the people around us, and this is a very small sample of mostly people who are in the same state that we're in. We're all peasants living in the same village, and although we'd like to aspire to be richer, we don't see that many people around us on an everyday basis to make us jealous, if you like. The problem with social media is that what it shows us is large numbers of people who appear to be so much more successful than we are, and this clearly creates a lot of psychological stress for people. It's one of the things that has been pointed to as making younger people very dissatisfied with their lives, because they see, there they are working very hard, writing their essay in the university library, and their social media feeds shows all their friends partying and having a great time out there, and it just makes them feel very miserable and dissatisfied with their life. So if that's the case, then these kind of stresses piling up on you, as you rightly say, millions of times more commonly than would have happened in the past, because of this sort of modern world and its technology. One might anticipate that there might even be, even without the benefit of having major civil wars or crises, economic crises to trigger these things, just the dissatisfaction created by the online world of social media might trigger a retreat into religion on a mass scale. Now, is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? It may be a good thing for the individual, in that it provides them with some kind of support and makes them more satisfied with their life and helps them cope with it. It might be a bad thing if the religion, exploits that to become very warlike to try to convert everybody else in the country or the world to that particular religion. And of course, that has happened many times in the past. The Judeo-Christian religions have a bad record on this. But, Buddhism spread to China and became very well embedded there historically through the Silk Road. It spread into Japan, became deeply embedded in Japan, Zen Buddhism. So some at one level religions are good for us, at the other level they're bad for us, in that they can become very destructive. So that's the problem we have to grapple with. I have no objection to people being religious when it's beneficial to them as an individual. It's just that we have to be careful that it doesn't kind of erupt like a volcano and have adverse consequences for us.
Thank you, Professor.